Well, my name is Charles Barry, and I want to share something very important with you that has to do with navigating relationships, having healthy relationships. So, a couple of years ago, I felt the Lord say to me, I need to create a safe emotional space for my wife. And so I went to her and I said, Lovey, if ever you feel I'm unreasonable, in the highly unlikely event of that ever happening, who can we go to? And so she chose Uncle Trevor and Auntie Val. And so I phoned Uncle Trevor and I said, Uncle Trev, if my wife uses the phrase, I feel like you're not hearing me, then I'm not even going to go into a discussion. I'm going to make a telephone call, and it will be a roundtable discussion, and whatever call you and Auntie Val make, that we will abide by. And we didn't have the language at that stage, but what I realized is that what I was doing is I was creating a platform of recourse. And so as you value relationships, I want to encourage you to do the same. The important thing is not just to say, okay, we're going to now be accountable to someone or a couple, and not give them binding arbitration. In other words, you're not just going to consider what they say just as mere advice, but you're actually going to submit to their counsel. Well, to continue, what happened was there were some challenges in our country with a bunch of key ministries where the pastor and his wife got divorced, not as a result of infidelity, but simply because they could not communicate. And that impacted the church throughout the country very negatively. And then the Lord challenged us to develop that accountability platform to all our peers in ministry, which we then shared. And so we ended up with a number of colleagues that we were both accountable to and were also accountable to us. So it was a mutual thing that developed. Little while later, my children were reaching the teenage phase, and I was reading Paul's letter where he says, fathers, do not exasperate your children. And children get exasperated or frustrated when they feel like they're not being heard. And so we spoke to our children and said, if you ever think that we as parents are unreasonable, obviously in the highly unlikely event of that ever happening, then who could we go to? And then they picked about 10 different couples. They, I think, wanted to make sure that at least one would be available. So I want to encourage you. The basic principle is that if you value a relationship, create a platform of recourse. So even when it comes to partnerships, very often we'll hear people say things like, wow, you shouldn't be in partnership, especially even Christian partnership, because of all the disasters, and they can tell you one horror story after the other. But the truth is, two are better than one, and the team will always beat the individual. And so the problem is then to navigate those relationships effectively. And so the principle is, if you value a relationship, create a platform of recourse. And so whether it's in a family or whether it's in a business environment or a team environment, it's important to be able to do that. We want our relationships to operate at peak performance. So when the people built this little car, it was designed to travel 55 miles an hour. And so the specs and the requirements are not the same as something that has to travel Mach 3. So tolerance determines performance. And that's one of the reasons why you have to have a code of honor in place, because when the pressure comes, in order to handle that pressure, you need to have the right tolerances. Here's a good resource that you might want to consider. It's called Team Code of Honor by Blair Singer, and I'm going to unpack some of these principles in creating a code of honor. Here's an 8-minute video clip that I recommend that you watch where Blair explains it. So let's use a cup to represent a business. And the contents obviously is the cash flow, the inventory, the staff, the systems, the customers, the product and the service that the company offers. If we had to look at a home, then the contents could possibly be the actual physical home with all the furnishings and the vehicles and everything else, and then also the people in the home, and we could also basically say the resources and the relationships. So the context or the environment is almost more important because it will determine whether the content is protected. And this has to do with your mission, your values, and then out of your values, for instance, like safety, integrity, and excellence, there are rules that come out of that, and those rules then make up your code of honor. So many families, many businesses have a context that is relatively weak, and it does not adequately protect the content. Yeah, you can see it's very important to have a strong context, because pressure will come from good things like growth. There's pressure on relationships, the economy growing or shrinking, staff challenges, government and competition. These are all things that create pressure, and therefore you need a very strong context. Just to reiterate, you can see that this precious liquid is now lost as a result of a broken cup, the context that was not strong enough to hold it. In business, this would be called bankruptcy, and in relationships, in a marriage, it would be called divorce. As you can see, a polystyrene cup or a ceramic cup is not necessarily going to do the job. You need something that is really strong to protect the content. And that's a leadership responsibility, to create a strong and maintain a strong context. So your context is basically your why, your vision, your mission, your values, and your culture that is underpinned by your code of honor. So as you can see, context demands a structure that facilitates synergy through teamwork. And for those of you that are wondering if there's a biblical foundation to this, here are some passages. 2 are better than 1 because they have a good return for their labor. That's in Ecclesiastes 4:9. Endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace, Ephesians 4:3. And then Paul's admonition to Timothy to teach them how to behave. So we can see here that obviously people need to be taught how to navigate good relationships and how to navigate in such a way that they can get the returns, the synergistic returns of being able to work together. When navigating good relationships, it's important to recognize this principle: life and death first, right and wrong second. Both are important. That's why you have a code. You want people to play by the rules, play by the same rules. But very often our motivation is questionable. And so if we go into a possible conflict situation, we need to recognize that life and death is more important than being right or wrong. You need to focus on being reconciled, not being right. You can be so right that you are not reconciled, and then you lose the relationship, the team falls apart, and then you've actually, both of you've lost. So being right often has to do more with ego than with justice. So what then is a code of honor? Well, a code of honor is a list of rules that come out of your values. Here are some definitions from Blair's book. A code of honor is the cornerstone of culture of any organization because it is the physical manifestation of its thoughts, ideals, and philosophies. So what does a code of honor do? It creates a framework so that everyone understands how to treat each other, not only in good times, but in times of challenge as well, when the pressure's on. A code of honor is the cornerstone of culture. It's a physical manifestation of the values extended in behavior. It's a framework for relationships. The core of the culture and the number one tool used to establish, refresh, broadcast, and demonstrate the culture of an organization or a relationship is the code of honor. So why is a code of honor necessary? Well, in the absence of rules, people make up their own rules. And some of the biggest collisions in finance, business, and relationships occur because well-meaning people are simply playing by a different set of rules. By the same token, the most miraculous results come from like-minded people who band together under some invisible bond to achieve greatness. And the question here is, what game are we playing and what are the rules? And if we agree to those, then we play well. What a code does is it brings out the best and attracts people that have the same vision and values that you have. So we see that the code of honor is a list of rules that comes out of your values. So, for example, if you value road safety, then a rule that comes out of that is to keep left and to stop at a robot. The second thing that the code of honor consists of is a protocol to encourage performance and compliance to the code. So it's a list of rules as well as a protocol. Physiologically, they can prove that when your emotions go up, your intelligence goes down in proportion. And so if you're going to create a code, you need to do so in a sane moment. And I want to encourage you not to have the attitude of a person who has a thatch roof house. When somebody approaches them to sell them a fire extinguisher, says, look, I've lived here for 25 years. This roof has never burnt. That's the kind of attitude that you don't want. You want to create a code when you don't need it, actually. So we start by finding recurring issues that repeatedly interfere with the performance of the team. And then we also look at rules that come out of the values. When you set up the code, it's important that everyone participates if you're going to get buy-in. Obviously, this is done in a company when you initially start, and as other people join, the code simply is explained to them. But that does not stop you from time to time revisiting the code to see if it still covers all the issues. As the code addresses behavior, you need to talk about things that have created tension and caused stress in relationships, and how those behaviors affected people both positively and negatively. This is self-explanatory. As soon as you're able to decide on a rule, write it down. You can change the draft later. Be specific. It must be able to measure behavior. The code of honor measures behavior, so don't try and legislate moods. The requirements for a fighter jet and the tolerances are much higher than that of a little Volkswagen. And so when you make the rules, you're wanting to push people to excellence, and so they need to have somewhat of a stretch. Before Moses brought the Israelites out of Egypt and into the promised land, while he was in the wilderness, shortly after they got there, God gave him 10 simple rules. So don't get carried away by making too many of them. Here are some rules that should form every code of honor. The first one is to deal direct. When the pressure comes and there's clashes in values and there's conflict, it's better to deal directly with the person. The second one that we have, which is common to most, is the mission of the team comes first. We put the interest of the team second, and my interests come third. Never abandon a teammate in need. When you're operating in a team, you want to go the extra mile. The code of honor is actually made up of two things. It's made up of the list of rules that you determine, and then it's also made up of a very important component, and that is the protocol for calling it. When there is conflict, how do you approach a person? Remember, at the beginning we said that this is about how we are going to treat each other when the pressure is on. And so the protocol is very important, and there has to be a willingness by the whole team to call it. Just to reiterate, the reason for calling it is to head off negative behavior that impedes performance. And secondly, it builds character, honor, and pride by engendering a spirit of being willing to do what we agreed to, integrity. And it underlines the fact that the rules support our values. Very important thing to realize in a team or in a marriage or in a family is that everyone gets to call, irrespective of their age, their gender, their skills. Everybody gets to call because we are a team. This is almost like shooting a movie with the director giving you a script that you need to follow. And the reason for that is that when your emotions go up, your intelligence goes down. And when you have a script to follow, it helps you. It helps you to mitigate the negative effect of your emotions. So there's a definite protocol. And first of all, you need to pick an appropriate time to speak to the person. Then you need to acknowledge your emotions. You need to ask permission to make the call at that time. And then when you do, you correct the behavior, not the person. And state specifically what didn't work and offer support. Make sure it's clear what the benefits are for correcting the behavior, not just for the team, but for the person being corrected. Remind them what he or she has already agreed to in the code. And then also it's important to acknowledge the proper behavior when it's demonstrated, to encourage them, and it will reinforce the behavior so that they will be motivated to repeat it. So the protocol for receiving a call, I want to remind you, and this is really true, that when your emotions go up, your intelligence goes down proportionately. So it's important that we create an environment there where the emotions are managed effectively so that good communication can take place. So assuming now that you've both mutually agreed to a specific time, this gives you time to prepare yourself, and you know what the protocol is, so you know what to expect, and that in itself already calms down your emotions. So then it's important also to take a deep breath and to hydrate. So by breathing deeply, you can even test it now. You'll see that your emotions come down. If you drink water, hydrate, your emotions come down. You want to be able to think clearly. So it's important now, having agreed upon a mutual time, you've taken your deep breath, you've hydrated. What you then need to do is you need to acknowledge that whatever the person is saying is true for them. That's really going to help you in not wanting to defend yourself necessarily. When you say to them, look, I acknowledge this is true for you. To really acknowledge that you are validating the person, and their perception is their perception, and that's the reality. But just by saying that, you're not saying that whatever you're going to say, I'm just going to 100% agree with. But you are validating that it's true for them. So there are a couple of options. So the person receiving the call, option number one is, if you've made a mistake, then ask the person how you can make it right and make amends to the team. You need to become truly interested and inquisitive about the call. And you need to say to yourself, how might others be seeing my actions? And why would that person come to the conclusion that they came to? It's time to do a little bit of introspection. And then the person calling you obviously then can explain to you how amends can be made and how you can fix up. If you, as the person on the receiving end, consider the call not to be accurate, then you both need to revisit the code and get agreement on what you consider was the rule and how it needs to be applied. If you cannot, then it's time to go for a platform of recourse. Okay, here's a diagram to try and help you make sense of this. So the first thing that happens is obviously the caller makes the call, and there can be either two responses, either yes or no. So if the person being called agrees to the call, then they admit they made the mistake. They ask the person how they can make it right and how they can fix up with the team. At the same time, there's the introspection to say, okay, why is it that people are perceiving me as such? And why would they come to that particular conclusion? Then when the caller spots the corrected behavior, there is praise and acknowledgement. Conversely, what could happen is the person being called disagrees, and in which case, if the call that is being made is not accurate, then you go back to the code and you clarify and try and get agreement. If after clarifying the code we get agreement, the person being called agrees that there was a violation, then obviously we go back to, if you make a mistake, admit it, and still do the introspection, and the caller acknowledges it. If, on the other hand, after clarifying the code, the answer is still no, and there's no agreement, then it becomes a matter of escalation. Yeah, two resources by Blair Singer. My prayer is that God will use this resource to enhance your relationships so that they could truly be as in heaven, so also here on the earth. If this has been a blessing to you and you've put it into practice and you've seen some positive results, please let me know. May God bless you.